When it comes to selling your business, every extra month of negotiations counts. In fact, an extra month could cost you a ton of money, and the buyers are counting on that. Your loss is often the buyer's gain. So let's talk about this other dark buyer strategy. This is a very common strategy that buyers will use to get your business on the cheap. One of the most annoying things for me to hear is my friends, who are all entrepreneurs for the most part, I see them talking about all these great emails that they're getting where it's some random buyer, they don't know who they are at all, promising huge amounts of money. They've never talked to them, and they'll start telling me, oh, they're valuing my business at 5, 6, or even 7 times of my net profit, which I know you guys would never do. So why would I go with you when I could go with them? See, the thing is, they're falling for the hook. I think it's very funny because a lot of my entrepreneurial friends, probably you out in the audience as well, are probably pretty marketing savvy. Most of digital entrepreneurs tend to have a core skill in marketing, but they don't see the hook. They don't see the bait and switch that is happening here when they get these kind of emails. Now, they'll tell you that all the way up to the point where they get you to sign an LOI. See, the buyer is trying to hook you in with an extraordinary situation. Let me pay you life-changing amount of money with this super sexy multiple that none of the brokers would ever in their life tell you that you're going to get. But that claim, which they don't tell you, is based on the actual due diligence and subject to change when they start digging deeper into your business. And that is where these 5, 6, 7x conversations turn into more like 2.5x conversations, which is lower than what I typically sell a business for on our marketplace. And buyers know that. But once you're in the LOI, once you're in letter of intent, once you're in exclusive due diligence, that is when buyers use this one thing to get you for a lower amount of money. And that one thing is time. So why if buyers are sending all these emails, why are they lying to you? So you got to first understand, what is the goal for the buyer? The goal of the buyer is not to give you life-changing money. Their goal is to get your business for as low as possible, which is how they might make their money on the spread when they go and flip the business that they acquire from you after growing it for, say, a year, 2 or 3 years. And the weapon of time really becomes apparent the moment you sign that exclusive due diligence. And now exclusive DD is quite common. I'm not saying that every buyer that gets you an exclusivity is trying to get you on the cheap. There is some real reasonable reasons why a buyer would want you to do this, because if they're going to spend all this time digging into all your numbers for you to just go and still entertain other offers to a buyer, that means you're probably not really that serious. We have sold businesses without any exclusive DD and businesses with exclusive DD. So I'm pretty familiar with how this works. And what they're trying to do, especially buyers who want to use time against you, is they're trying to make a very long period of due diligence upon you. So typically exclusive due diligence is going to last anywhere between 2 to 6 months, depending on the complexity of the business. And this is again why exclusive DD can reasonably last a long time. But in this case, where buyers are using time against you, they are going to keep extending the DD on you. At the end of that 2 months or close to 2 months, they'll be like, hey, the market is turning. Hey, my investors are concerned about XYZ. Hey, we need like another month. And soon, what was 4 months is now at 7 months, and they're just stringing you along here. And what this does is it builds up your fatigue, because you're still running your business while doing all these calls. It can feel almost like a medical exam of your finances. So by the end of that period, when they make you a much lower offer than what that initial email they sent you is, you'll just be like, you know what? I'm done with this thing. Just take it. I want this entire process to be over. That's what they're hoping you say. And that's what they're trying to do with this exclusive DD, trying to hook you on and isolate you. This is another reason why buyers do not want you to use a broker typically, because they know brokers like me create competition, and competition means they usually can't use time against you, where they're lowering your level of resistance to their much more lower ball offer. So another way buyers do this, where they're using time against you, even if you don't get seller fatigue, is if they sign an LOI with you and you have an agreed upon offer, but pending on DD, say they do it for like 6 months and you're in a fast growing position, like your company's high quality, it's growing, and then the offer is complete at the end of 6 months, well, your business is materially different now than what it was 6 months ago. So the buyer ends up extending this DD, he locks in your price to what the performance of the business was 6 months ago, and now the multiple that looked nice to you, that 5x, still comes down to 2.5 CapEx, because your average net profit has changed over the last trailing 12 months. Those additional 6 months that the buyer is giving you, but you guys have already locked in. Now, I've seen sellers take that deal from a combination of not realizing and seller fatigue. Luckily, I've also seen sellers say no to that deal. Like, we need to renegotiate the multiple because you guys took so freaking long. My business is much better than it was when you made an offer. So that's the right thing to say to these buyers. So let's talk a little bit more about other delay tactics that a buyer might use on you. Once they get you an exclusive due diligence, there are pretty much 3 main kind of delay tactics they're going to use to help extend the DD. Now, again, not all buyers do this nefariously, but some certainly do, so it's worth you knowing about it. The first is what I call the document dance. Now, this is where they're requesting documents in small batches intermittently throughout their DD phase. Instead of asking for like everything at once, or they're asking for you to reformat the information in a different way, well, there's last minute additional requests, circular information loops like, hey, where's this P&L for this month, or blah, 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 blah. It is endless, and it's enough to drive most entrepreneurs who are high creative a bit wild, because there's nothing we love more than shuffling around documents in our Google Drive, right? Tactic number 2 is the old team switcheroo. This is where new decision makers suddenly appear out of air. Now, this happens in a situation where you're dealing with a bigger buyer organization like private equity, a strategic, a family office. Typically, this won't happen if the buyer is another entrepreneur, even if they're savvy, because they probably don't trust anyone else on their team to do a deal, right? Because it's a pretty big part of their net worth to buy you. But this team switch has new decision makers that come that need to be brought up to speed, which leads back to the document dance that I talked about earlier. There's fresh due diligence requests because they want things that the other decision maker hadn't asked for, so you hadn't prepared. And previous agreements that you had with that previous decision maker are being reconsidered. So communication chains all lengthen, and we all know if you add another person to a deal, it doesn't become marginally more complex, it becomes infinitely more complex, just with all the different variations, because now you have to satisfy 2 different decision makers, possibly even 3 or 4, depending on the size of your business and the size of your buyer. This can easily eat up tons of time, but this next one is the most expensive one, but is something I have seen happen. So this one pay special attention to, and that's tactic number 3, the lawyer purgatory. So lawyers are fantastic. In fact, I've recommended many times on this channel, if you do not have a broker like us representing you when you go to sell a business, you need a lawyer. Like, especially if you're 7 figures and up, it's not just like a side hustle kind of valuation, like that's sub $500,000. You really should lawyer up with a lawyer that understands M&A transactions, who have done a few. But at the same time, everyone in M&A, something that buyers and brokers actually agree on, we agree on something for once together, is that lawyers are deal killers. Because the incentives of the lawyer is not to get the deal done. The incentive is to make sure that the lawyer doesn't look bad. And the lawyer can look good. In fact, there's a higher chance they look good if they make sure the deal doesn't go through, right? Because if the deal goes through and it does great, fantastic. But if the deal goes through and it harms you as the seller or the buyer, the lawyer gets nothing for that other than looking like, was it you who caused this? Was it your incompetency that did this, right? So the lawyer doesn't have usually the incentive to make the deal go through. And one of the ways they'll do that to make sure the deal doesn't go through is they'll look for every little thing possible in the contracts, in the paperwork, in the documents to say, no, Mr. Seller, no, Mr. Buyer, do not do it. And in bigger transactions where the seller and the buyer both have lawyers, they are often fighting each other over something, over negotiations that they're doing with each other that the buyer and seller don't even care about. It's like some nuanced legalese thing that the buyer and seller could care less about. Like, no one cares about this, period, whatever, right? So while lawyers are fantastic, you gotta remember that you gotta rein them in. You gotta make sure that they agree not to do this many amount of hours, or they have this deadline to do X, Y, and Z. And you can also tell the buyer that, and in fact, the buyer will probably agree with you and want you to do the same with your lawyer, because if a buyer has bought more than one business, it's likely that they have been in the lawyer purgatory themselves, and they weren't trying to use it as a dark buyer tactic at all, but their lawyer was using it for a way to get better hourly fees. So keep that in mind. This one isn't necessarily a buyer strategy that they'll use time against you, though sometimes they will, but it can still hurt you nonetheless. Tactic number 4, and this is a very classic one, especially if it's a new buyer who has watched too many videos about no money down, no money out of pocket videos of buying businesses, and that is the funding stall. The funding stall is where a buyer makes you an offer, you agree, and now the buyer says, okay, I need to go sort out all my finance. That should be a red flag in some areas, but this is actually very common in M&A. You see, a buyer can't really get financing until there is a deal to be financed. So they can get pre-approved all they want. Often that pre-approval is not going to be enough to cover the business unless it's like an SBA, but even then they'll still have to have some money. Typically what they'll do is they'll go out and get all that finance sorted now that they have all the numbers and information that they need from you to go and pursue that. So this is not uncommon, does take time, and some buyers will milk it to make it go further and further to again build out seller fatigue or to buy you at a later date because the multiple is already locked in from the agreement that you two have had. Another thing that can happen here is where the buyer can come back, say, hey, look, I wasn't able to get as much funding as I thought. How about I give you this amount upfront and we put that remainder into an earnout? That might have been their plan the entire time, by the way. In the more nefarious buyer strategies, they might be saying that as a way to get you to sell for less upfront, because even though they're paying the same amount, technically, money today is more valuable than money tomorrow. And most buyers, if they could, they would do 100% seller financing every time, right? So they're trying to get as much from you as possible. In this scenario, there's a few things you can do. One, you can just simply say no. You can tell them, like, look, great, go get financing, but if you can't get this upfront amount, the deal is off. It'll be very hard on that. Or another thing you can do if they come back to you, and by the way, you should give them a timeline, like, all right, great, you only have this amount of time to go do that before I go back on market then. And you want to be reasonable here because financing is not a quick thing, especially if you're using something like SBA. So work with your buyer, find out what their timeline is to know when the financing will be sorted. But the other thing you want to think about here is if they do come at you with, I was only able to raise this much, can we put it more into the actual earnout? You can say yes to that. There's nothing wrong with you saying yes to that. But because you're taking a bigger risk with your earnout, you should look at charging an interest rate. It should be a reasonable premium interest rate for you taking the extra risk on that earnout, and it's a way for you to get some extra money. You can do this through like promissory notes. There's all sorts of financial instruments you can do this with, but consider charging an actual interest on the buyer. Sometimes when a buyer gets hit with that, they're like, well, screw that, I'll just pay. Oh, no, like they'll magically find the money, right? To not have to do the interest, right? This is a way you can do a counter negotiation with it, where either they do end up coming up with the money or you get paid extra for taking that upfront amount of risk. Let's talk about some hard countermeasures you can use to make buyers not use time against you. Response time requirements. Speed is key. If you want the deal done, then be speedy. Every time a buyer asks you a question, answer it like that. You need to be the punctual one, be ultra responsive, be hyper responsive. In fact, when you go to sell a business, and this is especially true if you don't use a broker like us, I want you to prepare all the documents that you could think that a buyer might be going to ask you, put it into a special folder on your computer, your Google Drive, whatever you use, so that way you can instantly send it to every buyer. Because even if you do a private deal where you don't use us, you should be courting other buyers to create a competitive process so you can get a higher amount of money. So do everything you can to prepare in advance before you go to sell a business. So it's just a folder you attach every single time rather than having to track down all these disparate documents once more when you get asked by another buyer. Now, if you use a broker like us, of course, that is all taken care of for you, so you don't have to worry about that type of stuff. But this helps you dramatically and also prevents your seller fatigue, because it's pretty annoying going through like 30 different folders to get all the documents you need for every time you have a buyer request. Use a decision deadline structure. Make sure you have an active deadline with those buyers so they understand what kind of deadline they're on based on what you put forth. So you should control the situation is what I'm recommending. Next tactic is what I call the multiple guarantee. The multiple guarantee is what I was talking about earlier, where a buyer gets you in DD, you and him agree to a sales price. At the end of DD, your business is worth a lot more than that sales price. In fact, that sales price is now a much smaller multiple than what you could have gotten at the start of the DD. And this is an example of a DD takes like 6 months, right? So instead of agreeing to an actual sales price, you should be agreeing to a multiple. So instead of saying, yeah, my business is worth $2 million, which right now is a 4x multiple, instead of agreeing to that 2 million, agree to the 4x. So if you're in a fast growing business, then you are going to get a price at the multiple stage rather than the actual valuation stage when you first start DD. There you have it. This is how buyers use good old father time to get you for the cheap. Now, if you want to make sure that you get the most amount of money possible for your business, then go ahead and go to empireflippers.com/sell or click the link down in the video description below, and I will be happy to help you sell your business. Talk to you soon.